The rain came sideways at Blackstone Executive Airport, not the gentle kind. The kind that makes everything outside look temporary. Inside Hangar 9, a single work light cut through the dark. A man lay flat on his back, beneath a $30 million aircraft. Flashlight clenched between his teeth, hands moving through the aircraft's undercarriage with the patience of someone who had stopped trusting what he'd been told. He found something. Not broken. Not obviously wrong. Just off. A serial number that matched nothing. A component sitting in the one position where a failure wouldn't announce itself until 30,000 feet and no runway in sight. He didn't move for a long moment. Outside, the rain kept coming. Somewhere across the city, a merger's worth hundreds of millions was closing in 6 weeks. Somewhere in a corner office, a man who knew exactly what was in that aircraft was waiting for a signature. The man under the plane closed his notebook and kept going. The rain came sideways. That was the first thing Daniel Lopez noticed when he pulled his truck through the gate at Blackstone Executive Airport. Not the hangars. Not the runway lights blinking orange in the dark. The rain. Coming in from the west the way Carolina rain does in October. Mean and diagonal and making everything outside look like it might not be there tomorrow. He'd gotten the call at 6:47 that morning. He remembered the exact time because Nicole had been sitting across the breakfast table, pushing eggs around her plate, and his phone lit up with a number he didn't recognize, and she'd looked at it, and then looked at him, with that expression teenagers have, when they already know the call is going to take something from them. He answered anyway. The man on the other end introduced himself as Ronald Sanchez, Operations Director at Ashworth Meridian Holdings. The name landed with the particular weight of someone who expected it to mean something. And it did mean something. Ashworth Meridian was a logistics and real estate operation out of Atlanta's Midtown corridor. The kind of company whose name appeared on enough buildings and enough charity galas that people stopped thinking of it as a company and started thinking of it as furniture, part of the landscape, always there. Ronald described the job in 4 sentences. The company's Gulfstream G550 had been grounded for 20 months, following a combined electrical and hydraulic failure during approach to Hartsfield-Jackson. 3 maintenance firms had declined the work or given wait times measured in months. A submerger was closing in 6 weeks and the aircraft needed to be airworthy before it did. 4 sentences. No preamble. No asking whether Daniel had availability or bandwidth or any of the soft language people use when they want something but haven't yet admitted they need it. Just 4 sentences and then silence. The kind that expected a yes to appear in it. Daniel asked 2 questions. When was the last documented maintenance cycle? And what was the current condition of the hydraulic lines? Ronald said the full documentation would be available when Daniel came out to take a look. Not that it existed, that it would be available. The difference between those 2 things was the size of a door, and Daniel had spent 22 years learning to hear what lived inside that gap. He told Ronald he'd come take a look before agreeing to anything, and Ronald said that was fine in the tone of someone for whom the outcome of the look was already decided. Daniel set his phone face down on the table and Nicole was already watching him. Big job? Don't know yet. You're doing the thing. What thing? The thing where your face goes flat and you stare at the table and you're already somewhere else. He picked up his coffee. It had gone cold. He drank it anyway, because there wasn't a version of the morning where he was going to say out loud what was sitting on his desk in the back room, the letter from the bank, still sealed because he knew what was inside it, and knowing was different from reading it. And once he read it, the clock started in a way he couldn't pause. I'll let you know how it looks, he said. Nicole watched him the way 17-year-olds watch their parents when they've figured out something the parent hasn't said. She didn't push. She just picked up her plate and carried it to the sink, and he sat there another minute with his cold coffee thinking about his father. Joseph Davis had sat at a table like this one, in a kitchen that smelled like motor oil and coffee grounds, in a house in Gadsden, Alabama, in the fall of 1987, looking at a piece of paper that was going to cost him everything he'd spent a decade building. Daniel had been 14. He hadn't understood all of it then. He understood all of it now. Joseph had refused to sign off on a component batch. The parts had come through a procurement channel that bypassed the normal approval process, which was a sentence that sounded administrative. until you understood what it meant in practice, which was that someone was buying cheap and billing full price. And the only thing standing between that arrangement and the flying public was a maintenance technician's signature on a form that nobody above him wanted to read carefully. Joseph read it carefully. Joseph always read carefully. He flagged the discrepancy, filed a formal report, and was told by his supervisor that he was creating problems where none existed. He was told this a second time, more firmly, and then he was offered an opportunity to revise his inspection report, and he declined that opportunity. And 4 days later, he was no longer employed. Nobody investigated. Nobody recalled the parts. 8 months later, a regional carrier operating out of Birmingham put one of its turboprops into an emergency landing at Memphis International because the hydraulic system failed on approach, and the NTSB report, when it finally came, referenced a component batch sourced through an unapproved vendor. Joseph Davis was not mentioned in that report. He never worked in aviation again. He took work in a machine shop, then a fabrication facility, then anything that kept the house. He died on a Tuesday in March when Daniel was 29, in a hospital bed in Birmingham with the television on low, and the last conversation they had was about a carburetor Daniel had been rebuilding, and Joseph had asked 3 questions about the needle valve, and seemed genuinely interested in the answers, and that was what Daniel remembered when he thought about his father. Not the injustice, not the wasted years, the needle valve. The way Joseph's eyes sharpened when he was thinking through a mechanical problem, the way that sharpness never left him, even when everything else had been taken. Daniel had driven home from that hospital and sat in the parking lot of his apartment complex for 40 minutes before going inside. Then he'd started studying for his A&P certification. He wasn't going to make the mistake his father made. Not the original one. The original one was the right call, and Daniel would make it again tomorrow. The mistake was the one that came after. Not protecting the documentation, not building a record that could outlast the conversation. Joseph had trusted that the truth would be self-evident, and it wasn't, and by the time evidence would have mattered, the evidence was gone. Daniel was not going to let that happen. He drove to Blackstone Executive in the sideways rain and pulled his truck past the security gate and found Hangar 9 at the south end of the field, the kind of facility that had been well funded at some point, and then maintained at a level that suggested the funding had been redirected elsewhere. The overhead lights worked. The floor was clean, but the walls had the yellowed look of spaces that hadn't been repainted since a previous administration, and the equipment racks along the south wall held a combination of current tools and things that should have been desuccessioned a decade ago. The Gulfstream sat in the center of the hangar under auxiliary lighting, and the first thing Daniel noticed when he walked around the nose was that it had been worked on. Not recently, not well, but worked on. There is a difference, and it takes years to develop the eye for it, between an aircraft that has been damaged and left alone and an aircraft that has been touched by someone who understood enough to begin, but not enough to finish correctly, or who finished but chose not to document what they'd done, or who did both of those things deliberately. Daniel had seen deferred maintenance before. He'd seen corners cut and intervals ignored, and operators who treated airworthiness requirements as suggestions subject to negotiation with whoever was writing their check. This wasn't that. This was something that required a different kind of attention. He opened the forward avionics bay access panel and held his flashlight at an angle and looked for a long time without touching anything. The wiring bundles had been disconnected. Not all of them, but several 3 separate harness connectors that should have been seated and locked were hanging free in the bay, their terminal ends dangling without protective covers, and the disconnection was clean. Not the frayed, oxidized separation of something that had worked loose over time. Someone had disconnected these deliberately, and then left them that way. He stood up and wrote that in his personal notebook. Not the company form, his notebook. The company form went to clients. His notebook went nowhere. The hydraulic accumulator was wrong. He found that 20 minutes later, crouched under the belly of the aircraft, with his flashlight tracing the lines from the main gear well back toward the system's primary reservoir. The accumulator had been replaced. The fittings showed fresh thread compound, the kind that gets applied during installation, but the unit itself carried a serial number that he couldn't match to any manufacturer's catalog in his mental inventory, and Daniel Lopez had a very complete mental inventory. Not because he was exceptional. Because his father had told him that knowing your parts was the first defense you had. And he'd treated that advice the way other men treat advice about money or faith, as something foundational that didn't require justification. He photographed the serial number. Wrote it in the notebook. The maintenance logs were the worst part. He found the logbook in the cockpit compartment where it was supposed to be, which was one of the few things that was where it was supposed to be. He opened it to the most recent entries and worked backwards, and at some point he reached a gap. Not an entry noting that work had been deferred. Not a gap with a notation referencing a separate service record. Just an absence. The entries ran through a service in January of a year ago, and then there was nothing, no entries, no deferrals, no reference to the 28 months of operation. Between that January and the month the aircraft was grounded. 28 months. 40-some service intervals, depending on flight hours, just gone. Daniel sat in the co-pilot's seat for a moment and thought about that. Then he kept going. He found it when he pulled the lower access panel beneath the main avionics rack, a component occupying a position in the system architecture that governed the aircraft's directional flight control surfaces. The component itself looked correct from 3 feet away, same form factor as the unit that should be there, same color coding on the connectors. But the serial number didn't match, and the connector keying was subtly wrong, which he only caught because he ran his thumb along the housing edge and felt a ridge that wasn't on the spec diagram he carried in his head. He didn't react outwardly. He'd learned that too. The instinct when you find something wrong is to stop, to straighten up, to say something, or make a noise, or show in your posture that something has shifted. But posture carries information, and he wasn't ready to share information yet. He photographed the component from 3 angles, wrote the serial number, wrote the location, wrote the connector discrepancy, and replaced the panel exactly as he'd found it. He was on his way back to the nose section when he heard footsteps, dress shoes on polished concrete, the particular sound of someone who had come from somewhere carpeted and wasn't accounting for the echo. Ronald Sanchez walked through the hangar door in a suit that had been constructed by someone who understood fabric. He was 52 and built like a man who had once been athletic and had since converted that frame into something more stationary and better fed. His face carried the particular arrangement of features that communicated reasonableness, the kind of face that was useful in rooms where agreements needed to be reached and doubts needed to be smoothed. He laid out the contract terms on a cleared section of workbench with the ease of someone who had done this before. Parts, labor, a completion bonus if Daniel hit the delivery window. He said the number in a way that was designed to sound like generosity rather than opening position. Daniel asked for the complete maintenance records. All of them, including any third-party service orders going back to the aircraft's last major inspection. Ronald said he'd have someone pull together what was available. What was available? Not what existed. Daniel wrote that phrase in his notebook later that night, word for word, because phrases like that were evidence and evidence needed to be preserved exactly. The conversation ended with Ronald telling Daniel that the job just needed to get the aircraft flying, that previous work just needed to be finished up, and that Daniel shouldn't let paperwork get in the way of the practical side of things. Daniel nodded and said he'd follow up. He did not sign anything. He was walking back toward his truck when a second car pulled into the lot, a black sedan that parked with the precision of a driver who had been instructed never to park crooked. And the woman who stepped out was Sandra Anderson. He knew who she was the way anyone in Atlanta knew who Sandra Anderson was. She'd been in the business section often enough since taking over from her father, and the photograph in the Atlanta Business Chronicle had been accurate in the sense that it captured her face, but not the way she moved, which was with the deliberate economy of someone who understood that how you crossed a room was a statement. She came into the hangar still wearing her coat, damp from the rain, and she looked at him the way people look when they've already categorized you as a professional and are now deciding whether that category is going to hold. Can you do what the other 3 firms wouldn't? Not a question. An assessment delivered in question form. Daniel straightened up from where he'd been crouching beside the nose gear bay. He wiped his hands on a shop cloth. He looked at her directly. I can't promise it'll be ready in 6 weeks. I can only promise it won't leave this hangar before it's safe. Sandra looked at him for a moment with an expression that was doing several things at once. She was evaluating the answer. She was evaluating him. She was deciding whether what he'd said was a refusal or a warning, and whether a refusal and a warning were different enough to matter. Then she turned and walked back toward the rain without saying anything else, and Daniel watched her go and understood that this was a woman accustomed to answers that arrived pre-shaped to match what she needed to hear, and that his answer had not done that, and that this might mean she hired someone else, and that this was not a reason to have given her a different answer. He drove home in the dark. Nicole was still up, textbook open on the kitchen table, and she looked at the clock when he came in and then at him, the sequence reversed from this morning, and he told her the job was big. She asked how big. He said the kind where someone had done a lot of work they didn't want anyone to be able to follow. She was quiet for a moment, processing this. Are you going to take it? Haven't decided, but you probably are. Go to bed, Nicole. She went. He sat at the kitchen table for a while with the lights low, turning the serial number over in his head, the one from the directional flight control component, the one that matched nothing in his catalog. Then he went to the desk in the back room and stood in front of the bank letter for 30 seconds. Still sealed. He left it that way and went to bed. Rachel Flores showed up at the hangar at 7 the next morning, with a hard case of diagnostic equipment, and the specific expression she reserved for jobs that were going to be worse than advertised. She had that expression often. She'd worked alongside Daniel for 11 years, and she'd developed it somewhere around year 3. When she'd begun to understand that his threshold for calling a job was the opposite of most people's. Most people called the job done when the most obvious problems were fixed. Daniel called the job done when every problem was fixed, which was a different standard entirely, and one that had cost him, over the years, a great deal of time and a moderate amount of client patience. Rachel had never once suggested he lower the standard. She set the case on the workbench and opened it and looked at the aircraft and looked at him. Walk me through it. He did. She listened without asking questions, which was how she always listened, banking the information first, running the analysis second, and only speaking when she had something that moved the understanding forward rather than sideways. When he got to the directional flight control component and the serial number, she was still for a moment. You pull it? Not yet. Wanted you to see it in place first. She nodded. They called Scott Hill, who had been working in aircraft maintenance for 8 years and had a particular skill with hydraulic systems, and Jacob Walker, who was primarily electrical, but had the additional quality of being methodical enough that he wouldn't miss something because he was moving too fast. Both men arrived within 90 minutes. The 4 of them divided the aircraft into zones and went to work. The methodology was Daniel's, and it was not fast. He'd developed it over years of working on aircraft that had come to him from situations where corners had been cut, and the cutting wasn't immediately visible. You started from first principles. You treated every system as suspect until it could prove otherwise. You didn't skip steps because the previous step had checked out, because the relationship between one step and the next was not always linear, and someone who understood that could use it against you, could create a situation where each individual element looked acceptable, and the failure lived in the space between them. By the end of the first day, they had a list of 11 anomalies. By the end of the 3rd day, the list had grown to 26. Ronald sent an email on the morning of day 4 asking for a status update, and Daniel replied with a detailed inspection report, photographs, component serial numbers, system references, a specific accounting of each discrepancy discovered, and its implications for continued airworthiness. 3 hours later, Ronald sent an acknowledgement that used language designed to make Daniel's findings sound like scheduling inconveniences rather than structural problems. The report, as it apparently reached Sandra Anderson, had been reduced to a single paragraph noting that the contracted technician was running over budget and behind schedule. Daniel didn't know this yet. He found it out on day 9. Sandra called the hangar directly. Her voice was controlled, but the control was doing more work than it usually did, which told him someone had told her something that she hadn't fully accepted. but also hadn't fully rejected. He could hear her working it out in real time, deciding how much of what she'd been told to believe. I'm hearing concerns about the pace of progress. The pace is determined by what I find, not what anyone expected to find. The completion timeline. If you'd like to discuss specifics, I'll lay every inspection report in front of you unedited. Everyone. You can compare them to whatever summary you've been receiving and draw your own conclusions. Silence. I'll come this afternoon, she said. She arrived at 2:30 and found him on his back beneath a wiring conduit in the main cabin, pulling a connector apart by hand because the torque had felt wrong when he turned it with a tool, and wrong torque on a connector that had passed visual inspection meant something had been assembled incorrectly in a way that wouldn't be obvious until it failed in the air. She stood at the edge of the work area and watched him without saying anything. He was aware of her there. He didn't stop what he was doing because the connector was at a point in the disassembly where stopping would require starting over, and starting over on this kind of work cost time and time, at this point in the project, was a resource he'd been carefully managing. When he sat up and showed her the connector, the internal contact bent at an angle invisible from outside the housing, the kind of failure that would pass every visual check, but would eventually create an intermittent autopilot dropout. At altitude, she looked at it for a long time. She didn't apologize for her earlier tone, but she didn't repeat it. And Daniel noticed something that he noticed rarely in clients, particularly clients of her profile. She was watching him work the way you watched someone when you were revising an assumption. Not performing attention. Actually paying it. Ronald had come out 2 days earlier, ostensibly to check on progress, and had spoken to Daniel with the smooth patience of a man explaining something obvious to someone slower. He'd said the project needed to stay on track, that the completion deadline was firm from a legal standpoint, and that the company's attorneys had reviewed the contract language and found it unambiguous. Daniel had said he'd reviewed the contract as well. Ronald had smiled in a way that was doing a different job than smiling usually does, and Daniel had gone back to work. Now, Sandra was here, and Daniel was showing her a bent contact inside a connector housing, and her face was making the particular adjustment faces make when information is arriving that contradicts the picture someone else painted. He noticed something in the side pocket of the co-pilot's seat while he was recalibrating the cockpit instrumentation later that afternoon. A photograph printed on real paper in the era before digital was standard. George White standing on a sunny tarmac beside this aircraft, one arm around a girl who was maybe 15, both of them squinting against the light. The girl was Sandra, not the Sandra who'd stood in this hangar an hour ago, a younger version, unpolished in the way teenagers are before the world finishes shaping them. Daniel looked at the photograph for a moment. Then he placed it exactly where he'd found it, at the same depth in the pocket, same orientation. On the instrument panel above the radio stack, a small mechanical clock with a cracked crystal had been left untouched by every technician who'd worked on this aircraft before him. He found a soft cloth in his kit and cleaned the face of the clock carefully. He moved on to the next item in his sequence. Rachel found the thread on day 12. She'd been running the unidentified serial numbers through every accessible database since day 2 manufacturer registries, FAA aircraft records, third-party parts certification systems, gray market tracking lists maintained by industry associations. On day 12 she found it. The component in the directional flight control position had been supplied by a company called Vanguard Aero Supply, incorporated in Georgia 3 years prior, operating from a registered address in a business park off I-285. She pulled the billing records. Vanguard had invoiced Ashworth Meridian's aviation division for just over $4 million in components during its 3 years of existence. Every purchase order, every approval signature, every disbursement record. One name on all of it, Ronald Sanchez. She's brought the records to Daniel, the way she brought him everything that changed the shape of a problem. She set the papers on the workbench beside his notebook, stood back. Let him read. He read. He didn't react outwardly. He'd learned that too. He sat with it for a moment. Then he stood up and began doing something he'd been planning to do since day 2, but had waited to confirm. He pulled 3 external hard drives from his bag. He started copying everything, every inspection report, every photograph, every dataset, every document Rachel had pulled, every timestamp and metadata record onto 3 separate drives. And when he was done, he put one in the lockbox in his truck, one in the bottom of his tool case, and one he drove to his house that evening, and put in the safe behind the furnace. Nicole was doing homework at the kitchen table when he got home. Bo koon kom. The question slipped out in Vietnamese the way it sometimes did when she was tired and not guarding the language shift. English. Nick, are you okay? Same question. Different weight. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment. The bank letter was still on the desk in the back room, still sealed. The number Ronald had offered was enough to clear it, with left over room enough, potentially, to keep the building, to upgrade the diagnostic equipment, to hire the additional technician he'd been needing for 18 months. The job is complicated, he said. You keep saying that. Because it keeps being true. She looked at him with 17 years of having watched him come home from complicated jobs, and she understood something he hadn't said, the way she often did. Is it the kind of complicated where you do it anyway? He thought about Joseph Davis. He thought about the sealed letter. He thought about the component with the unverifiable serial number sitting in the position that governed whether the aircraft could turn. Yeah, he said, that kind. Rachel was at the hangar before him the next morning. She had the Vanguard documents spread across the folding work table in the order she'd organized them: serial numbers, invoice dates, installation records, approval signatures. She was cross-referencing them against the maintenance log entries that did exist. Working methodically, building a chain of documentation that could be followed by someone who hadn't been present for any of it. Daniel stood beside her and looked at the spread of paper. The flight control component, he said. That's the category, she said. Parts supplied by Vanguard, installed in flight control positions, across a 3-year billing period. He understood what she was saying. The $4 million hadn't been an isolated transaction. It had been a pattern. He went to his notebook and opened to a fresh page. He wrote the date at the top. Then he began making a list of what he knew, what he suspected, and what he needed to confirm before he would know the difference between those two things. The list had 21 items by the time he finished. He looked at it for a moment. Then he closed the notebook, picked up his flashlight, and went back to work, because work was the thing he could control, and control was the thing you held on to when everything else was moving in directions you hadn't chosen. The rain was gone. The hangar was dry. The Gulfstream sat under the lights with its panels open and its secrets visible, and Daniel Lopez had 22 years of knowing how to read what an aircraft was trying to tell him. He listened. The parts approval system broke on day 14. Not all at once. Piece by piece. The way institutional resistance always works when someone above the request doesn't want it fulfilled, but also doesn't want to be seen refusing it. Daniel submitted the hydraulic seal order on a Tuesday morning. By Wednesday afternoon, it was sitting in a review view queue that hadn't existed when he'd signed the contract. He called the procurement contact Ronald had assigned, a man named Edward Harris, who answered emails at 11 at night but never before noon. And Edward explained that orders above a certain threshold now required secondary authorization from the operations director's office. The threshold had been $5,000. It was now $800. Daniel hung up and did the math. He pulled up his personal line of credit on his phone, looked at the available balance, looked at the parts list, pulled out his debit card and placed 3 orders directly: hydraulic seals, a wiring harness section for the forward cabin, and a pressurization controller that the aircraft needed in a way that was not optional and not deferrable. The total came to $9,400. He wrote every transaction into his project ledger with the date, the amount, and the notation that these were personal advances against a contract in which Ashworth Meridian had agreed to cover all authorized parts costs. Rachel was watching him from across the workbench. How deep are you in now? He told her the number. She nodded once and went back to work. She didn't suggest he stop. She didn't suggest a workaround. They had worked together long enough that she understood the architecture of his decisions, the way you understand the load-bearing walls of a house you've lived near. You don't need them explained, because you already know which walls you can't remove without the ceiling coming down. The thing about Rachel Flores was that she had left a better-paying position at a regional carrier 8 years ago to come work at a 2-person shop in Atlanta, and she had never explained why, and Daniel had never asked. Some things are self-evident if you pay attention, she'd told him once offhand, during a late night on a Cessna with a fuel system that refused to cooperate, that the best maintenance work she'd ever seen was done by people who understood they were not working on machines. They were working on the space between a machine and the people who trusted it. He'd written that down later. He wrote a lot of things down. Day 17 arrived with an email notification about a contract amendment. Daniel read it at his desk at home at 6 in the morning, before Nicole was awake. Then he read it again. Then he went to his project folder and pulled the original contract and laid both documents side by side on the kitchen table. The delivery date had been changed. In the original contract, the completion target was listed as a goal, with language around it that acknowledged the exploratory nature of the repair scope. Standard language for a project where the full extent of the work wasn't known at signing. In the amendment, that language was gone. The delivery date was now a binding deadline, with a penalty clause that authorized Ashworth Meridian to withhold all final payment if the aircraft was not certified airworthy and released to flight operations by that date. Daniel had not signed any amendment. He checked his email record from the day of signing. He checked the document metadata. He checked his own copy of the original. Then he created a folder on his encrypted drive and put both documents in it, with a written note timestamped and witnessed by no one, which he understood was imperfect, but it was what he had at 6 in the morning before the sun came up. He called Mark Anderson at 7:30. Mark was a friend from college who had become an aviation attorney, not by plan but by a series of events that included a clerkship, a mentor, and a fascination with the intersection of technical systems and legal liability that Daniel understood completely. Mark picked up on the second ring, which meant he was already at his desk, which was true of Mark every morning, because Mark had never once in his adult life not been at his desk by 7. Daniel explained what he'd found. Mark listened without interrupting, which was one of the things Daniel valued about him, the ability to hold a full picture before reacting to any part of it. A pause. Then, they're building a box, Daniel. They need you to fail to deliver on a deadline you never agreed to, so they have a reason to not pay you. That's what this is. I know. You're documenting everything. Everything. Good. Keep going. Don't slow down. Don't give them anything procedural to point at. Whatever happens in that hangar, your work has to be unassailable. Daniel said he understood. And Daniel, a different tone now, the one Mark used when he was about to say something that required its own space. If what you're describing with the Vanguard parts is what it sounds like, the serial number anomalies, the falsified billing, the scale of it, this isn't a contract dispute. This is federal jurisdiction. FAA, potentially DOJ. You understand what you're carrying. Daniel looked out the kitchen window. The backyard was still dark. My father carried the same thing 30 years ago, and nobody helped him carry it. A longer pause. You're not your father, Mark said. No, Daniel said. I learned from watching what happened to him. Day 19 produced the kicker. He pulled the name of the certifying engineer from the flight control components installation file, the sign-off that was supposed to document that a licensed engineer had inspected and approved the components installation. The name was there, the date was there, the certification number was there. Daniel ran the certification number through the FAA registry, which is public record and takes about 45 seconds, and found that the engineer in question had surrendered his vest Ashworth Meridian authorization 14 months before the date printed on his sign-off. Someone had used a departed employee's credentials to falsify an airworthiness sign-off on a directional flight control component, sourced from a company that didn't exist in any legitimate supply chain. Daniel photographed every page of the file. He wrote a single entry in his personal log, found it. Then he put the log in his bag and went back to the aircraft because there was nothing else to do. The people who falsify records do not stop when they're suspected. They accelerate. Which meant whatever documentation still existed inside Ashworth Meridian's systems was already at risk, and moving fast on his end was the only response that mattered. He called Mark again that evening from the truck. Mark said, "You need to understand something. What you just described, using a former employee's credentials to sign off on an airworthiness document, that's not a paperwork violation. That could put people in prison. I know. It could also put you in a complicated position. If someone decides to build a narrative where you're the problem. I know that too. Are you going to keep going? Daniel was quiet for a moment. He was parked outside his house. The kitchen light was on. He could see Nicole's silhouette at the table, still doing homework at 9 o'clock. The kid who pushed harder than he'd ever pushed at her age. The kid who had spent her whole life watching her father come home tired and go back early and build something out of nothing with his hands and his name, and who had apparently decided that watching was not enough, and she needed to build too. My father stood exactly here 30 years ago, Daniel said. He did the right thing and the system ate him alive because he didn't protect the evidence. I'm not making that mistake. Mark didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice had something in it that wasn't quite admiration, but lived in that neighborhood. Then protect it, all of it, and keep working. He kept working. The hangar had its own rhythm now, the four of them moving through the aircraft in a practiced sequence. Rachel on avionics, Scott Hill on hydraulics, Jacob Walker on electrical, Daniel covering everything that fell between categories or didn't fit neatly into anyone's zone. Ronald's interference had settled into a pattern of attrition, small delays, missing authorizations, parts orders that sat in limbo, and Daniel had developed a parallel process for each one, a workaround that didn't require approval, and a documentation trail that showed exactly why the workaround had been necessary, and who had created the conditions requiring it. He was building two things simultaneously, the aircraft and the record. And then on day 23 Sandra came back. She arrived at 9 in the evening, without announcement, which was becoming a pattern of hers. And Daniel noticed that she had stopped dressing for these visits the way she dressed for the rest of her day. The first time she'd come, she'd been in the full architecture of a CEO coat, heels, the whole presentation. Tonight she was in dark slacks and a jacket that looked like it had come from the back of a car, and her face was carrying the specific tension of someone who had been told two contradictory things about the same situation, and had not yet resolved the contradiction. Ronald had called her. She told Daniel this directly, standing in the center of the hangar with the aircraft between them and the overhead lights, casting everything in that flat, functional illumination that hangar work happens under. Ronald had told her that Daniel was deliberately withholding the delivery certification to extract additional payment beyond the contract terms. That the delays were leverage. That the company should consider legal action before the end of the week if he didn't comply. She laid all of it out in the open, which was the thing Daniel respected about her. She didn't pretend she hadn't been told it. She said it directly and waited for a response. He listened without interrupting. He let her finish completely. Then he walked to his tool chest and opened the second drawer and took out a single bolt, a standard-looking piece of hardware, hexagonal head, zinc-plated, the kind of component that lives in 1,000 locations on an aircraft this size. He placed it on the flat surface of the chest between them. Pull up the most recent Vanguard Aero Supply invoice for the directional control linkage assembly. Sandra looked at him. Then she took out her phone and navigated to whatever document system she used and found the invoice. She read the specifications line for the bolt listed as supplied for that assembly. Then she looked at the bolt on the workbench. The thread pitch was different. The tensile grade stamp was different. What she was holding on her phone described a component designed for a specific load rating in a specific position in the aircraft's steering architecture. What was sitting on the workbench in front of her was not that component, but it had come from that position, and it had been billed to her company as if it were. She didn't say anything for a moment. Daniel didn't say anything either. He had learned in 22 years the difference between silence that needed to be filled and silence that needed to be inhabited. This was the second kind. Ronald Sanchez arrived in the hangar within 15 minutes of Sandra pulling up that invoice, which meant someone had called him, which was information in itself. He came in with the composed urgency of a man managing an outcome rather than responding to a surprise, and he explained that minor competent substitutions were standard practice in procurement, that the parts were functionally equivalent, within acceptable engineering tolerances, and that Daniel was dramatizing a routine variance to manufacture the appearance of a safety issue where none existed. He said it with the fluency of a man who had assembled this sentence, or something very close to it, before. The words came out in the right order with the right weight distribution, the way practiced testimony does. Then he turned to Daniel, and his voice dropped to a register that Sandra would catch the tone of, but not the words. And what he said was, "A man with a bank foreclosure notice on his property isn't in a strong position for a legal fight with a company that employs 40 attorneys. Just so we're clear about what this is." Daniel looked at him. Then he nodded once and went back to work. That night, he drove to 3 separate locations and confirmed that the drives were secure. He went home and sat at the kitchen table in the dark for a while. Nicole's door was closed, light off. He could hear the neighborhood, a dog somewhere, a car passing on the main road, the ordinary sound of things that weren't collapsing. The bank letter was still on the desk. He opened it. The number inside was not a surprise. He'd known what it was going to say, but reading it made it different from knowing it. The way reading a diagnosis is different from suspecting one. It closes the door on the version of reality where you might have been wrong. He put the letter back in the envelope and went to bed and lay there thinking about the directional control component, about the wear characteristics of an improperly rated bolt under cyclic load stress, about the physics of what happens to an aircraft's steering authority when a load-bearing fastener in that system reaches its failure threshold. He did this not because he enjoyed it, but because understanding the specific mechanism of failure was part of how he maintained what he needed to maintain, which was clarity about what the stakes actually were. The stakes were not the contract. The stakes were not the money, though the money was real, and the foreclosure was real, and the number in the letter was real. The stakes were whoever would be sitting in the seats of this aircraft when it reached altitude over Virginia or Tennessee, or wherever it happened to be, when the component that shouldn't have been there finished doing what incorrectly rated hardware does under sustained load. Those were the stakes. He went to sleep with that knowledge arranged carefully in the part of his mind where things are stored that cannot be set down. Sandra came back that night. 11:30. A knock on the hangar's side door, the small one, not the main bay entrance. He was still there. He'd stayed late running a bench calibration on a cockpit display unit that had been giving inconsistent readings. He opened the door, and she was standing there with 2 cups of coffee from a gas station on Riverside, which was not where someone like Sandra Anderson usually got her coffee, and he understood that she had stopped somewhere between wherever she'd been and here, rather been Ghanaian, and bought the most available thing, times, because the correct thing would have required more time than she wanted to spend on the way. She came in. They sat on the maintenance steps at the tail end of the aircraft, a good spot, out of the direct sight line of the main bay windows, though at 11:30 there was nobody to have a sight line. She asked about Nicole. He said she was ready for something new. New school, new start. The kind of readiness teenagers have that's partly genuine and partly a performance of not being affected by things that affect them. She asked how long he'd had the company. He said 11 years. He said it started with a lease on a piece of a hangar at a smaller field south of the city, and 2 certifications and a used diagnostic kit, and the understanding, which had come from watching his father, that the only thing in this business that outlasted reputation was evidence. Your father, she said. Not a question. Something she'd already been thinking about, he told her. Not all of it, the relevant parts. Joseph Davis, Alabama, 1987, a component batch, and a formal report, and a job that ended because he wouldn't revise what he'd found. The machine shop, the years, the Tuesday in March. He never heard anyone say he was right, Daniel said. Sandra held her coffee cup in both hands and looked at the concrete floor. My father had a clock in this aircraft, she said. On the instrument panel. Mechanical, he never let anyone replace it even when the crystal cracked. He said it was more honest than a digital display because you could see the mechanism working. Daniel said nothing. I sat in this cockpit about 6 weeks after he died, she continued. Before any of this started, I came out here by myself and I sat in his seat, and I thought I'd feel something definitive, something that would tell me what to do next. She looked up. I didn't. The hangar was quiet in the way large enclosed spaces are quiet, not silent, but structured around a low ambient sound that made spoken words feel private. What do you actually think happened, she said. Not her CEO voice. The other one. The one that existed underneath the architecture. Daniel looked at the aircraft. At the panels still open, the systems exposed, the interior lit by the work lighting he'd left on. I think someone spent several years making decisions about what went into this aircraft based on what those decisions would do for their own financial situation, he said. And I think whatever documentation would let you trace that was removed or altered to make it look like a series of unrelated maintenance oversights rather than a pattern. He paused. Whether any of that connects to your father's death, I can't tell you. I don't have evidence of that. What I have evidence of is that this aircraft was not maintained in a way that was honest, and that the dishonesty was systematic. She sat with that for a while. Then, Ronald has been with the company for 14 years. I know. My father trusted him. Your father trusted his signature on a document. That's different from trusting the man. Most people don't know the difference until something shows them. She stood up first, which was how she always left abruptly. Like a decision made rather than a conversation ended. She thanked him for the coffee, which was her coffee, which he hadn't paid for, and he understood that the thanks was not for the coffee. After she left, he sat for another few minutes in the quiet. Then he went back to work. Day 26. Rachel came in early and went straight to her laptop without speaking. Daniel knew this posture. It meant she had found something overnight that she hadn't finished processing. He let her work. Around 9 she looked up. The server files are gone. The Vanguard Aero Supply documentation that had been accessible in Ashworth Meridian's maintenance management system, the billing records, the purchase orders, the installation logs that Rachel had been cross-referencing against the physical components had been deleted sometime between midnight and 6 in the morning. Not archived, not moved to a restricted partition. Deleted. Rachel reached into the inner pocket of her jacket and placed an encrypted external drive on the workbench. I cloned those directories on day 9, she said. Before I knew what was in them. Standard practice. I do it on every job. Daniel looked at the drive. He looked at Rachel. When did you start doing that? He said. After the 3rd time I found something important that someone had already gotten rid of, she said. Which was on the 4th job I worked for you. He picked up the drive and held it for a moment. 11 years. She had been quietly building insurance against exactly this kind of situation for 11 years. Not because she'd expected it on any particular job, but because the nature of their work attracted this kind of situation. And she understood that documentation was fragile, and evidence required caretakers. He handed the drive back. She went to the work table and started printing. The deletion confirmed 2 things. First, that someone inside Ashworth Meridian had access to the maintenance management system at a level that allowed permanent record removal. Second, that the deletion had been triggered by Sandra's conversation with the board chairman the previous evening. The conversation Daniel hadn't been told about, but could infer from the timing, because that was the only event in the previous 24 hours, significant enough to prompt it. Someone was watching the board meetings, day 28. He found the engineer. He'd been building the documentation chain for the falsified sign-off, pulling every record that touched the installation of the Vanguard directional control component, trying to establish a complete timeline that an outside investigator could follow without assistance. In doing so, he found a second falsified document, different engineer's name, different component category. Hydraulic system this time, in a position that governed the landing gear extension and retraction cycle. The engineer listed had left Ashworth Meridian's authorized vendor roster 18 months before the sign-off date. 2 falsified credentials, 2 different components, both in positions where a failure would be catastrophic and difficult to diagnose from the cockpit in the window of time that mattered. He called Mark. It's a pattern, Mark said when Daniel finished. This isn't opportunistic. Whoever did this understood exactly which components could have their certifications falsified without triggering an immediate red flag. They understood the inspection protocols well enough to stay just inside the threshold for routine audit, which means it's someone with technical knowledge. Or someone who had access to someone with technical knowledge. A pause. Daniel. This is bigger than the Gulfstream. If this vendor supplied components across the fleet, I know, you need to assume they did. I know that too. The call ended. Daniel sat in the truck in the parking lot and looked at the hangar. Inside, Rachel was cross-referencing. Scott and Jacob were working. The aircraft was open and its systems were telling him everything they'd been keeping. Because systems don't lie, they just wait for someone who knows how to listen. He went back inside and told Rachel to expand the Vanguard billing search to the entire aviation division's procurement history, not just the Gulfstream. She looked at him. She understood what he was asking and what it meant for the scope of what they were dealing with. That's going to change the picture significantly, she said. It already has, he said. We're just catching up to it. The invoice arrived on day 30. Daniel submitted it at 9 in the morning. $240,000, itemized, labor, authorized parts, personal advances with supporting receipts. The completion bonus written into the original contract, which still existed and which he had not amended, and which still said what it said. He sent it to the procurement contact, copied to Ronald's office, and then he drove to Mark Anderson's building in Midtown, and left a copy there, with the receptionist in a sealed envelope, with Mark's name on it, because by this point, leaving copies of things with trusted third parties was not paranoia. It was procedure. Ronald convened a meeting with legal before lunch. By 2 in the afternoon, Daniel had a notification. Ashworth Meridian was withholding final payment pending investigation into alleged contract violations, including breach of the delivery deadline, the one Daniel hadn't agreed to, and the use of unauthorized parts sourced through unverified channels. The notification arrived via email from a legal coordinator Daniel had never communicated with. It was written in the passive voice throughout, which was a choice. Ronald delivered the conclusion personally. He came to the hangar at 4 and stood in the doorway with the composure of a man performing the last step in a sequence he had planned carefully. And he told Daniel that the company would not be paying the submitted invoice. He offered a reduced amount, roughly 40% of the total, as a settlement payment, in exchange for a signed airworthiness certificate and a release of all claims. Daniel set down the torque wrench he was holding. He walked to the workbench. He picked up the hangar key, the physical key, the one issued at the start of the project, and set it on the flat surface of the bench. He kept his certification card in his pocket. Ashworth Meridian owns the aircraft, he said. But nobody in this building has the authority to declare it safe to fly. That authority lives with the person who holds the certification and understands the complete inspection history. I don't work for your company. I work for the standard. Ronald looked at him with the expression of someone recalibrating the expected sequence of events. You're making a mistake, Ronald said. A man in your financial position can't afford the legal exposure of walking away from a contract. Daniel looked at him for a moment. Then he picked up his bag and his notebook and his personal toolkit. I didn't walk away, he said. The work is done. The aircraft is almost ready. What it isn't is certified. And it won't be certified until the component provenance is verified by an independent authority with no connection to your procurement chain. He stopped at the door. Those are not the same thing. He left. That night, Ronald Sanchez directed a technician to carry a sealed box from an off-site storage location into Hangar 9's equipment room. The box contained 17 components, all Vanguard Aero supply, none with valid airworthiness certification, placed on a shelf in a position where they could later be characterized as unauthorized parts that Daniel Lopez had sourced himself and brought to the project. The technician had been with the company for 7 years. He followed the instruction without asking what was in the box, because not asking was what his employment had trained him to do, and because Ronald Sanchez was the man who signed performance reviews, and because the specific calculus of institutional loyalty is something most people don't examine closely until after the moment when examining it might have mattered. The next morning, Sandra Anderson arrived at Blackstone Executive with a car service and a schedule that required wheels up by 9. She walked into the fixed base operator terminal under the assumption that the situation had been resolved. Ronald had told her the technician, his word for Daniel, deliberately impersonal, had abandoned the project after failing to negotiate additional payment, that the aircraft had been completed and properly documented, that a certification from an alternative inspector would be processed within the hour. She settled into a chair with her phone and her calendar, and the forward momentum of someone who had already moved past an obstacle. She did not yet know that Timothy Clark had been in the hangar since 7:30. Timothy was 55 years old and had been flying George White on business routes across the eastern seaboard and the Gulf states for 11 years. He had 7,000 hours in type. He had the bearing of a man who had spent decades in the left seat of aircraft that weighed more than houses, and understood at a molecular level that the distance between routine and catastrophe was maintained entirely by the quality of the work done on the ground before departure. He had opened the maintenance logbook at 7:31. He had read Daniel's technical entries. He had observed the absence of a final airworthiness certification from the certifying authority. He had looked at the open discrepancy noted in the log, the unresolved flight control assembly question, the unverifiable component serial number, documented and signed by Daniel Lopez in ink and dated. He had placed the logbook back on the table. His hand was still on the cover when the operations coordinator came to tell him the aircraft was ready for pre-flight. Timothy looked at the coordinator, then at the logbook. When Daniel Lopez clears this aircraft, he said, "I'll begin pre-flight, not before. Those two events are not interchangeable." The coordinator went to find Ronald. Ronald made calls. The first officer was contacted. The first officer asked, specifically, whether Daniel Lopez had issued an airworthiness release, and when the answer was no, the first officer said he was unavailable for the departure, and Sandra Anderson sat in the terminal with her phone and her calendar, and the forward momentum of someone who was about to discover that momentum, on this particular morning, had nowhere to go. 2 contract pilots were reached by phone before 9:15. The first one declined when the dispatcher mentioned the incomplete airworthiness release. The second drove out to Blackstone Executive, parked in the lot, walked the perimeter of the aircraft in the morning light, found the maintenance logbook, read the open discrepancy entry Daniel had written in ink, the unresolved flight control assembly question, the unverifiable serial number, specific and dated and signed, and drove away without going inside the terminal. Nobody called after him. There was nothing to say. Sandra stood at the terminal window and watched the second pilot's car leave the lot. Ronald was beside her with a revised plan already forming. He knew 2 independent inspectors who could issue an expedited certificate. He had their numbers. He could have someone on site within 3 hours. The merger closing was in 5 days, and the acquiring party's principal needed this aircraft operational as a condition of the final meeting. It was symbolic, he said, a matter of optics, and the optics could not sustain a grounded plane. Sandra looked at him, then at the aircraft on the tarmac. The Gulfstream sat in the late morning light with the specific stillness of a thing waiting. Not broken, not ready. Waiting. She went to find Timothy Clark. He was in the crew room off the main hangar bay, seated at the small table with a cup of coffee he hadn't touched. The logbook open in front of him, to the page Daniel had last written on. He looked up when she came in. She asked him directly. She was always direct with Timothy because he was the kind of man who took indirection as an insult. "Why won't you fly?" Timothy closed the logbook. He didn't close it with finality or drama. He closed it the way you close a book you've finished reading, with a kind of settled completeness. He told her about a morning several years back. He'd arrived at this same hangar at 6:40 to begin pre-flight for a 7:30 departure. George White was already there, standing at the nose of this aircraft, impatient in the way he got when schedules were threatening to slip. And there was a young maintenance technician, not young in years, maybe 35 at the time, but young in the sense that he hadn't yet accumulated the particular gravity that comes from surviving the thing you're about to describe, standing between George and the aircraft door with a handwritten 3-page document and an expression that had decided. George had found a fuel feed irregularity in the pre-flight check 2 days prior and reported it, and the technician had documented it, and a different technician at a larger shop had looked at it and said it was within tolerance and signed off, and George had decided that was enough. The young technician had decided it was not enough. He had his own documentation, 3 pages of handwritten analysis, cross-referencing the specific irregularity against the manufacturer's service bulletin history for this engine family, showing a pattern of similar reports in aircraft with comparable flight hours that had been classified as within tolerance right up until they weren't. George told him he was overstepping, told him in front of 2 ground crew, voice raised enough that the words carried, told him his job was to maintain the aircraft, not to hold the aircraft. The technician didn't move. He said, "Mr. White, my job is to make sure this aircraft comes back. That's the whole job. Everything else is secondary to that." George flew out on a different charter that morning, furious. The Gulfstream stayed on the ground. The manufacturer was contacted. The fuel feed irregularity was found, upon closer inspection, to correspond to a known defect that had been the subject of a safety bulletin issued 6 months prior that the previous maintenance provider had failed to log against this specific airframe. 2 weeks later, George White sent a letter to the technician's business address. Timothy didn't know the full contents of the letter. He'd heard it described. What he knew was that from that day forward, George White had trusted Daniel Lopez's signature the way you trust a level, not because you like it, not because it's convenient, but because you've watched it prove itself against something real. Sandra stood across the table from Timothy and felt the story land somewhere deeper than her executive function reached. "He could have lost everything that morning," she said. Timothy looked at her steadily. "He nearly did, and he stayed anyway." That's the thing about a signature from someone like that. It doesn't just tell you the work was done. It tells you who did it. She left the crew room and walked back through the main hangar bay. She was not thinking about the merger. She was not thinking about the board or the optics or the 5-day window. She was thinking about the locked compartment behind the co-pilot's seat, the small cabinet her father had kept sealed for as long as she could remember, the one she carried a key to that had been given to her by the family attorney after the funeral, with a note that said simply, "When you need it." She had carried that key for 18 months without using it. She went to the aircraft and climbed the stairs and sat in the co-pilot's seat for a moment in the quiet. The instrument panel held all the usual geography of a cockpit she'd spent years glancing at from the passenger cabin, the gauges and switches, and the small mechanical clock with the cleaned crystal face. She had not noticed it was clean before. Someone had cleaned it. She opened the compartment. Inside, beneath a folded sectional chart of the Southeast United States, was a sealed envelope with her father's handwriting on the front. Not a company label, not a typed address, his handwriting, and beside the envelope, a voice recorder, the small digital kind he carried in his shirt pocket, the one she'd seen him use in meetings for 20 years, the one that recorded everything, and that she had always assumed went with him into the ground, because nobody had mentioned it afterward. She picked up the recorder first. She pressed play. Her father's voice came out of the small speaker and filled the cockpit. Too close, too immediate. The wrong tense, present tense, when everything about him was past tense now. And the collision between those two things was something she hadn't braced for and couldn't. She put one hand flat on the instrument panel and held it there and breathed and let the recording play. It was a conversation. Her father and Ronald Sanchez. Aboard this aircraft, from the ambient sound of it, the slight pressurization hum, the particular acoustic signature of this cabin at altitude. Her father was asking, in the patient register he used when he already possessed the answer, and was offering someone the courtesy of the truth before he arrived at it, without them. Why the aviation division's maintenance expenditure had increased by 31% over the prior 3 fiscal years, without a corresponding increase in fleet size, flight hours, or any documented upgrade to facilities or equipment. Ronald's answer came out smooth and detailed and entirely plausible, the kind of answer that had been assembled rather than recalled, each piece fitting the next with the seamlessness of construction rather than memory. Her father said he understood. A pause in the recording. Then, in the same quiet voice, the voice that had told her bedtime stories and negotiated real estate deals, and dressed down subordinates without once raising it above conversation level. "When I get back from Miami, I'm going to ask for a full audit of every third-party vendor relationship in the aviation division. Everyone. I want the source documents, not the summaries." The recording ended there. George White had not come back from Miami. She sat in the co-pilot's seat with the recorder in her hand, and the clock ticking on the panel in front of her, and let the weight of what she'd just heard arrange itself into a shape she could look at without flinching. It took a while. She gave it the time it needed. Then she opened the envelope. The letter was 4 paragraphs in her father's hand, written on Ashworth Meridian letterhead, with a date from 3 years before his death. He had written it after a maintenance review. He didn't specify which one that he described as having shown him something he'd been allowing himself not to see. The tone was not corporate. It wasn't even executive. It was a man writing a private accounting of a thing he intended to correct and had not yet scheduled. He wrote that the sole reason any aircraft in his fleet had remained airworthy across his 20 years of ownership was the existence of people in the maintenance chain who refused to treat their professional signature as a social gesture, who understood that a certification document was not evidence that work had been performed. It was a guarantee that the work had been performed correctly by someone who would stand behind that word correctly in any room, before any authority, at any personal cost. He wrote that such people are inconvenient, that they are expensive, that they create friction at exactly the moments when friction is least welcome, and that any operation that allowed them to be pressured into compromise or silence had already begun to fail, even if the failure hadn't yet produced an event visible enough to name. He wrote, "I have allowed this. I intend to stop allowing it. This letter is a record that I said so." Sandra folded the letter, put it back in the envelope, put the envelope in her jacket pocket, got up from the seat and climbed down the stairs into the morning light. Ronald was waiting on the tarmac with his phone and a name, an independent inspector out of Chattanooga, who had done expedited reviews before and could be on site by early afternoon. He said the man was certified, experienced, and understood that business timelines had their own kind of pressure that pure technical work didn't always account for. Sandra looked at her phone. She had 4 messages from board members. She had a calendar notification for the merger prep call in 90 minutes. She had a text from the acquiring party's attorney asking for a status update on the aircraft availability, because the principal's attendance at Friday's closing was contingent on it. She put her phone in her pocket. "I'm going to find Daniel Lopez," she said. Ronald started to speak. "I'll call you when I've done that," she said, and she walked to her car. Lopez Aviation Services was a 15-minute drive from Blackstone Executive, on a secondary road that ran behind an industrial park near the southern edge of the city. The building was a modest facility, a main hangar bay, a small office, a partsums, the kind of space that reflected the precise amount of investment someone makes when they're building something real, rather than something that looks like something. Bank closure notice was on the front door, taped at eye level. The kind of document that doesn't give you the option of not seeing it. Daniel was inside. He had a crate on the floor, and he was placing tools into it with the methodical efficiency of someone who had done the math on how much space tools take up and had a plan for where they were going. He looked up when she came through the side door. He registered her without changing his pace. She told him what she'd found, the compartment, the recorder, the letter. She didn't dramatize any of it. She laid it out in sequence because sequence was how it made sense. He set down the tool he was holding. She told him she was prepared to release payment immediately, that she wanted him to return and complete the certification, that whatever Ronald had put in front of her in the last 3 weeks, she now understood it had been a picture of a situation designed by the person most invested in her not understanding the actual situation. He was quiet for a moment. "My signature covers everything," he said. "Not just the work I did, the whole aircraft. Everything in it, including whatever was installed before I got there. Payment doesn't change the provenance of a component that doesn't trace to any legitimate source. Money doesn't make a fake serial number real." She asked him what he needed. He told her. An independent inspection authority with no connection to Ashworth Meridian's procurement chain. A full component traceability review on every flight-critical part in the aircraft. Payment released to his team in full, regardless of the review's outcome. Because his team had done their work and they were owed their work regardless of what the review found. "The problem isn't what I did," he said. "It's what was done before me. Someone built something dishonest into this aircraft and then built my work around it, so the trail would stop at my name. I'm not signing my name to a trail that stops at my name." He had everything spread on the work table. She stood over it and read, not a summary, not Ronald's version, the serial number records, and the Vanguard billing histories, and the falsified engineer sign-offs, and the timestamp data, showing the server deletion and the original contract beside the version that had been amended without his knowledge. 20 minutes of reading. He kept packing. He didn't stand over her. He gave her the documents and the space to understand them on her own. When she looked up, her face had the particular quality of someone who has just seen the same set of facts from a perspective that makes the original picture unrecognizable. "I signed the payment hold," she said. "I know, I didn't." She stopped, started again. "I was given a version of this that made you the problem." "I know that too." He set another tool in the crate. "The question isn't whether you were deceived. You were. The question is what you do now that you've read the same documents I've been reading since day 2. She took out her phone. She called the chairman of the board. She didn't tell him everything. She told him she was initiating an internal audit and needed 48 hours before any decisions were made about the merger timeline or the aircraft status. The chairman asked questions. She answered the ones she could and told him the rest would be addressed in a full board meeting at the end of the 48 hours. Ronald heard about the call through whatever channel he maintained inside the boardroom. He interpreted the 48-hour request as uncertainty, which told Daniel when he heard about it later a great deal about how Ronald understood people. He understood them as positions in a negotiation rather than as individuals with reasons. Uncertainty, in his model, meant the outcome was still available to be shaped, so he began shaping. He directed the removal of the Vanguard components from the hangar equipment room and arranged transport to a facility he controlled through a business arrangement that didn't have his name on it directly. He moved quickly. He was good at moving quickly. Rachel Flores had been given observer access to the independent auditor's tracking system as part of the documentation process Sandra had initiated. When a shipping manifest appeared for a delivery originating from Blackstone Executive and terminating at a warehouse address in a part of the city not associated with any aviation business, she flagged it. The auditors intercepted the delivery. The warehouse was registered to a limited liability company. The sole listed officer was the brother-in-law of Ronald Sanchez. Inside were 312 components across 17 part categories. None had valid airworthiness certification. Many carried counterfeit manufacturer markings that, under close inspection, had the wrong font spacing and the wrong material finish. All of them had corresponding billing records, from Ashworth Meridian, stretching back 4 years, invoiced through Vanguard Aero Supply, at an average markup of 260% above the cost of comparable legitimate parts. The board meeting happened 2 days later in the Ashworth Meridian conference room on the 14th floor, and it was not the meeting Ronald had planned to be in. He arrived with an explanation. The components in the warehouse were legitimate alternatives sourced through non-conventional channels. The pricing reflected expedited availability and specialized procurement logistics, and Lopez Aviation Services itself had used unauthorized parts, the very parts currently logged in the Hangar 9 equipment room storage records. He said this last part with the confidence of a man whose bet was already placed, because he had placed those parts there himself. Daniel set a folder on the conference table. Inside was the hangar's internal access log, a time-stamped record of every entry to every room in the facility, maintained automatically by the keycard system. He opened it to the relevant page, the storage room entry from 2 nights prior. The timestamp, the keycard ID assigned to a technician in Ronald's direct reporting chain, a time that fell 4 hours after Daniel had submitted his invoice for the completed work. The parts had arrived after the invoice. The parts Daniel supposedly sourced illicitly had physically entered the building after the project was contractually complete. Ronald's expression was the expression of a man whose contingency has just become the evidence. Daniel kept his voice even. He said, "Every component I installed in that aircraft is documented. Source, certification number, installation date, installer signature. If you pull the aircraft's physical inventory against my work records, there are no gaps. What's in that equipment room isn't on my list because I didn't put it there." Ronald shifted to a different track. He addressed the board directly. Daniel's termination from a previous employer 7 years ago, the history of contract disputes, the financial distress that gave him every incentive to fabricate a crisis in order to extract payment he wasn't owed. Daniel said the termination was accurate. He said the reason was also documented in the public record. He had refused to certify a component batch purchased from an unapproved vendor. He had been asked to revise his inspection report. He had declined. He had been let go. 11 months later, the same firm recalled the entire batch following a Federal Aviation Administration inquiry into a series of anomalous hydraulic events in their operating fleet. The recall documentation was on page 12 of the binder already distributed to the board. Ronald had nothing for page 12. Sandra suspended him pending investigation. Before the meeting adjourned, she authorized the payment releases in writing, in front of the auditors and the board. She instructed outside counsel to coordinate with the FAA's Civil Aviation Security Division. Ronald's voicemail resignation received that evening, couched in language about the company's best interests, was forwarded without comment to the attorneys. The auditors spent the following morning adding the detail that changed the geometry of everything. The same category of Vanguard components, flagged in the Gulfstream, had been installed in 2 other aircraft in the Ashworth Meridian private fleet. Both aircraft had been flying, not dozens of flights, dozens, across the eastern seaboard, the Gulf Coast, the mid-Atlantic corridor, passengers aboard, crew aboard. Systems that shouldn't have been trusted because nobody who knew what to look for had looked. Sandra made a call from the conference room before anyone had a chance to recommend a strategy. She grounded the entire fleet. The flight operations coordinator confirmed the hold in 60 seconds. 3 board members objected simultaneously. The practical language of financial exposure, reputational damage, the merger timeline, the relationships with the principals who were expecting to fly on those aircraft to a Friday closing that represented years of negotiation. She looked at them the way her father had looked, at the people who told him things he disagreed with, patient, specific, already past the argument. If there is a failure on one of those aircraft, she said, we will not be talking about a merger. We will be talking about something that can't be fixed with a press release. Ground the fleet. That's not a discussion. The merger collapsed 3 days later when the acquiring party's due diligence team discovered the fleet grounding through an industry filing and flagged it for their principal. The principal's attorneys sent a withdrawal letter that was careful and professional and final. Sandra had expected this. She had made the decision about the fleet, knowing it would produce this consequence, and she had made it anyway. Because the alternative was a merger built on a concealed structural liability, and the tacit agreement to continue concealing it, and that was not a transaction she was willing to complete. Some things you can't fix later. This was one of them. Daniel and Rachel spent 2 days on the remaining aircraft. Same methodology, same documentation standard. They found the same component class in the directional flight control systems of both same Vanguard provenance, same absent certification chain, same installation pattern inside maintenance windows that had been recorded with the minimum required detail. Neither aircraft had experienced a failure. The load profiles on both were lower than the Gulfstream's, which meant the components hadn't yet reached the stress thresholds where improper ratings become physical events. But Daniel's inspection notes were specific about what those events would look like and why the onset would not give a crew adequate warning. He wrote it plainly. He always wrote plainly. 2 board members circled back to the argument that Daniel was positioning himself for a long-term contract out of the crisis, that the fleet grounding and the scope of the inspection work created a dependency, and that the dependency was the point, and that someone with his financial pressures had every incentive to make himself indispensable. Daniel asked to speak. He told the board he was resigning from the project, effective upon delivery of all documentation to the independent auditors. He said this into a room that had been expecting something else entirely. He said, the pilots who flew those aircraft didn't make the decisions that put them at risk. Neither did their passengers. They were just people who got on airplanes because someone's signature told them it was safe to get on airplanes. Those people deserve the same standard every aircraft deserves before anyone puts their name on it. That's what I'm here for. Not the contract. The room was quiet in a different way than it had been before. Sandra authorized the payment in full $240,000, plus interest for late payment, plus reimbursement of every personal advance Daniel's team had made during the project. She signed it in front of the auditors, the board, and Rachel Flores, who watched, with the expression of someone who has been waiting a long time for a specific piece of paper to exist and is now watching it become real. Daniel had told Sandra early in the process that he wouldn't sign a confidentiality agreement. She hadn't asked him to sign one. The wire cleared that afternoon. He drove to the bank after and paid the outstanding amount on the Lopez aviation account, and he sat in the parking lot afterward for a moment with the engine running, thinking about nothing in particular and everything in general. The way you sit when a thing that has been pressing against you for a long time suddenly stops. He thought about Joseph Davis, not about the injustice, not about the machine shop or the years, about the needle valve, about the way his father's eyes sharpened when he was working through a mechanical problem. And the sharpness was the man, the whole man, unchanged by everything that had been taken from him. He drove back to the hangar. The final inspection took 3 days after the replacement components arrived. Each one certified, traceable, documented to a standard Daniel reviewed personally before authorizing installation. The chain of custody was clean from manufacturer through distributor through receiving, and he cross-checked every serial number himself, because cross-checking was not something you delegated on flight-critical components. It wasn't distrust of the people around him. It was the nature of what the signature meant. When the work was done, he stood in the cockpit. The instrument panel looked different when everything behind it was right. Not visually different. The gauges were the same gauges. The switches were in the same positions. But there was a quality to the space when you knew the systems were what they were supposed to be, a settled integrity. The way a structure feels different when the load is distributed correctly. The clock was ticking, still on the panel above the radio stack. Small and mechanical and honest about what it was. He thought about his father a final time. Not with grief exactly, though grief was part of it, with something closer to continuity. Joseph Davis had stood in front of the same essential choice. Daniel had been standing in front of, for 30 days, the choice between the signature and the consequence of withholding it. And he had made the right call, and the system had chewed him up. And nobody had said he was right until it was too late for him to hear it. Daniel could not give his father those years back. He could not reconstruct the career, or restore the reputation, or sit at that table in Gadsden and tell the man across from him that his read on the component batch was correct and would be vindicated, and that the vindication was coming. What he could do was this. He uncapped his pen. He signed the airworthiness certificate. He signed it because the aircraft was safe completely, verifiably, documentably safe, and because that had always been the only condition under which his name went on anything, and that condition had not changed under financial pressure or legal threat or any of the other forces that had been applied to it over the past 30 days. The signature meant the same thing it had always meant, which was why it still meant something. Timothy Clark arrived at 6 the following morning. He went to the aircraft without stopping at the terminal, without asking anyone for a status update, without requiring any of the reassurances that people without trust in the system usually need. He opened the aircraft door and sat down in the left seat and began his pre-flight, with the unhurried attention of a man who has learned to trust certain things completely. The 2 contract pilots who had declined the departure 3 weeks prior both arrived at Blackstone Executive before 7. Neither had been called. The dispatch coordinator told Daniel this later, slightly confused, as if the self-reporting needed explanation. It didn't require explanation. The release form was in the system. Daniel Lopez had signed it. That was the instrument of information that mattered. Everything else was logistics. The engines turned over at 7:40. Daniel was standing at the edge of the tarmac in the early light. The sound of the engines rising to operating temperature moved through the concrete under his feet and up through his legs. And he stood there and let it. Rachel was behind him, slightly to the left, with her clipboard, because she always had her clipboard, but she wasn't writing anything. She was just listening. The Gulfstream taxied to the runway threshold. The engines came up to departure power. The sound changed in the specific way it changes when a turbine crosses from idle into commitment, a deepening, a settling into purpose, the machine becoming fully what it was built to be. It broke from the runway cleanly. No hesitation, no deviation from centerline. The nose rotated at exactly the right speed, and the main gear lifted at exactly the right moment, and the aircraft climbed into the Georgia morning without anything that required a remark, which was exactly correct. The absence of anything to remark on was the point. 2 hours of systems evaluation over the airspace north and west of Atlanta, every flight surface, every redundant channel, every automated response, and the aircraft performed without deviation. Timothy brought it back on the ILS, rolled onto final, touched down on the numbers. The landing was the kind where the passengers don't know it happened until the engine noise changes. He came down the stairs and crossed to where Daniel was standing. He put his hand out. Daniel took it. "She'll take Sandra anywhere she needs to go," Timothy said, and the word anywhere carried the weight of what it had cost to make it true. Sandra presented the check at the following week's board meeting. Daniel told her the wire had cleared. She said she was aware of that, and she held the check up briefly so the room could see it. And then she told the board it was going to be framed and mounted in the conference room, beneath a line on a small brass plate. She said she'd written the line herself. The plate read, "No schedule, contract, or executive authority stands above the safety of this aircraft." The board members who had objected to the fleet grounding didn't object to the plate. In the months after, Lopez Aviation Services expanded in the way things expand when they're built on something real rather than something performed. A second technician hired, a larger diagnostic array installed, a formal independent inspection agreement with a regional carrier whose safety officer had heard about the Ashworth situation through the industry network that moves accurate information faster than any press release. The bank lien was cleared. Rachel's loan, the one she'd extended quietly to the business during the final 2 weeks of the project, the one Daniel had found only by going through the accounts line by line. The one she'd never mentioned was repaid. He told her he'd found it. She said it had been a business decision. He said he knew it wasn't. She said fine and went back to work, and that was the end of that. Except it wasn't really, because it never is when someone does something like that for you. Sandra came to the shop on a Thursday afternoon in early spring. 2 coffees. No appointment, no assistant. She and Daniel sat in the small office off the main bay for an hour and talked about things that weren't the aircraft. And in the middle of it, Nicole called. And when Daniel came back in, Sandra asked what she'd said. He said she'd asked how things were going with the CEO who kept showing up with coffee. Sandra said that was none of Nicole's business. He said he'd told her the same thing. She said good. He said agreed. A man came through the shop door with a folded maintenance record under his arm and found Daniel at the desk and asked how long it would take to get his airplane flying again. Daniel took the logbook. He turned 3 pages. He looked at the man. "I'm not paid to get it flying," he said. "I'm paid to make sure it comes back." The man nodded, slowly, the way people nod when they've just understood something they hadn't known they needed to understand. Rachel in the adjacent bay heard it. She'd heard it before. She heard it every time, and every time it landed the same way, not as a slogan, not as a line, but as a statement of exactly what was true, offered plainly to someone who had just walked through the right door. Outside, through the open hangar bay, the Atlanta sky was doing what it does in spring, layered and moving, the kind of light that makes you think about altitude, about the distance between the ground and wherever you're going, about the people who make it possible to close that distance safely, about the ones who understand that a name on a document is not a formality, it is a promise. And some people, the ones who matter, the ones who hold the whole system together without ever getting a plaque for it, treat it exactly that way. Every time, without exception. Regardless of the cost.